were in fact central to the city's growth. After all, they'd been migrating to Bombay for the past 300 years and had a right to entertainment. Similarly, bar owners also argued in court, in fact, that the ban was detrimental to the interests of working class men. And finally, when the Mumbai High Court upheld the right to livelihood of bar dancers, it also normalized men's need for entertainment. Now, our understanding of male sexual desire is contingent, to say the least, and we felt the need to really place these markets in sexual labor against the broader canvas of changing patterns of sexual engagement in India today. And to help us think through these cultures of consumption and economies of sexual desire, we have with us one of India's most prominent sociologists, Professor Srivastava. Professor Srivastava is a British Academy Global Professor at University College London and a Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. He's an anthropologist by training, and he's a prolific author with several books to his credit. His research focuses on cultures of modernity in India, and his publications include Constructing Postcolonial India, National Character in the Doom School, which was published in 1998, Passionate Modernity, Sexuality, Class, and Consumption in India, which was published in 2007, Sexuality Studies, which was published in 2013, Entangled Urbanism, Slum, Gated Community and Shopping Mall in Delhi and Gurgaon, which was published in 2015, Critical Themes in Indian Sociology, which was published in 2019, and finally, Histories of Desire, Sexualities and Culture in Modern India, published in 2020. So Shitapa has already mentioned, the title of his talk today is Street, Footpath, Gated Community, Masculinity, Pornography, and the Erotics of Tradition and Modernity. And before I hand over to Professor Srivastava, I'd like you to please mute your mics and also to post your questions in the chat function, because there are several of you and we will struggle to have you speak personally to him. And finally, our hashtag for the lecture is Laboring Dance, Laboring Performance. So now over to Professor Srivastava.
Thank you, Prabha, and thank you to all of you for organizing this. It's great to be here. Just to sometimes you, in case my voice becomes there's some problem with the mic, let me know and I'll use the headphones. Can you hear me right now? Is it okay?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Great. Okay. So let me just start with my paper. So, as you know, that this workshop is part of the broader projects and the laws of social reproduction, and I'm hoping that what my discussion will do is try and present, contextualize some of the themes that you're exploring. I noticed, for example, the marriage market continuum is a significant part of the project. So what I'm trying to do is to think about how to position these relational aspects within a context of urban change, consumer cultures, new forms of religiosity, and scattered nature of desire, and I think the broader field of cultural production within which these ideas are positioned. So I'll begin. So my talk explores the relationship between space and sexual subjectivity in contemporary India. The broader context of the discussion concerns relationships between new cultures of consumerism and space, changing class positions, and narratives of sexual intimacy. So in an earlier work, I'd examined the spatialized meanings inherent in what I refer to there as footpath pornography, and the present discussion kind of builds upon that. However, whereas the concern in the earlier work, in the footpath pornography work, was with the circulation of meanings regarding desire and intimacy amongst primarily the urban poor, the present discussion tries to broaden that sphere and adds an additional context, namely sexual narratives that address the urban middle classes, or what I imagined as the middle classes, as readers as well as subjects. My discussion also provides an ethnography of certain new spaces of residence and leisure, which, though seemingly unconnected to sexuality and intimacy, are, I suggest, vital to an understanding of sexual modernity in India. In the case of middle class culture, and I put middle class in inverted commas, I will talk about the relatively new medium, the internet, and a pornographic comic that had come to enjoy widespread popularity and continues to have popularity. And it's been there in various incarnations. and I refer here to the Savita Bhabhi comics. In order to provide the background to the discussion, however, let me begin with the account of footpath pornography, because I think that's how I will try and contextualize it and provide a contrast to what I want to finally address in this discussion. So this section is called the Spaces and Context of Footpath Pornography. The publications that I refer to as footpath pornography are Hindi language. Of course, there are many languages. Hindi language booklets that are available all over North India. Typically, they are very cheap to acquire, depending on the purchaser's bargaining skills, and are poorly printed and bound. It is also not unusual for there to be missing pages that abruptly cut short climactic endings. They are, as my naming of the genre indicates, most frequently available at transit bookstalls that crowd the footpaths surrounding some of the busiest transit areas of the city, railway stations, interstate bus stands, etc., as well as commercial and small-scale industrial localities that serve as the workspace and home to a large numbers of the urban laboring populations. The booklets are part of circuits of urban mobility. For their purchasers, most frequently acquire them in between, say, catching a bus or a train, and as commodities, they circulate among men who are themselves vulnerable to frequent changes of employment and residence. The booklets are usually published by city-based small-scale presses based in various poorer localities of the city, as well as industrial locations, and sometimes also by publishers of provincial newspapers, of Hindi newspapers in small towns. And while the readership for this material might be quite varied in terms of class, a very sizable section consists of young men of limited means, quite often living in slums and shanty towns under conditions of great insecurity of tenancy and landholding, and working as factory labor and in a variety of other casual or informal occupations. Theirs is a world of constant and enforced mobility. Changes in market conditions lead to frequent job losses, and changes in government land policies lead to evictions from their unauthorized places of settlement. And of course, we can only now, we don't need to think of it in context much further than the COVID-induced mobility that cities have been characterized by very recently. Booklet cover photographs often portray European women or versions of westernized Indian women who pose in poses of rapture and seduction. Let me just try and share the screen. Sorry. Oops.
Professor Srivastava, yes, we can see your screen.
I just need to bigger, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just make it full screen.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. The authorship of the booklets is, as far as can be determined, almost exclusively male. Of course, there are some significant exceptions. It is as goods that are on public display and hence must be purchased in public. It is men who are also the purchasers. However, it is impossible to say with any certainty that the booklet's readership is exclusively male. This conclusion is based on the nature of the content of the booklets. So there is a considerable amount of material that addresses women to advise such so-called satisfactory sexual relationship with men, as well as there are articles and letters supposedly by women on proper sexual conduct and premarital and extramarital relationships. Now, whether such writings are actually authored by women may not be as interesting a question as the one about writings and its appeal for this audience, for this readership. Indeed, there is scattered evidence across other mainstream registers of Indian public culture that the booklets may actually have an established and perhaps growing female readership. So let me give you an example. This is a quote from a very well-known mainstream Hindi magazine called Grey Shobha, which in fact has one of the largest circulations in India. So this is a column which is advice to girls, to young women staying in university hostels on how to avoid becoming involved in lesbian relationships. And I quote, "If your roommate likes to read vulgar literature, look at pornographic pictures, or talk about things that excite the imagination, then you must clearly tell her that you cannot share a bed with her. While living in a hostel, protect yourself from the passing thrill of vulgar literature, video cassettes, and pornography. remember that one gets attached to such material in almost unconscious manner, but that it is very difficult to break the attachment. So this column continues, stay away from them completely and talk about this with your roommate even before you share a room with her. End of quote. This is a quote from an article in the Hindi language magazine Grey Shobha. Now, the emergence of new spaces in the city where single young women may reside away from parental control is also a context of the alternative routes of circulation of the footpath booklets. Hence, though women may not buy the booklets directly, we cannot say that they do not have access to them. And although later, of course, I'll refer to women in my talk is primarily about male desire, because that's a field that I want to address in order to think about the broader cultural fields within which such material and ideas of the erotic are produced. The appeal of the booklets, the footpath pornography booklets, is as I just suggested, implied, built upon their articulation in a number of contexts that speak to the lives of urban men of limited means. Hence, we might treat them as primers on relationships between tradition and modernity, I put this in inverted commas, an introduction to contemporary commodity culture, and a site of fantasy culture of modernity. More significantly, I think, they tell us something about different kinds of relationships between subaltern urban masculinities and myriad political and cultural economies of the city. This aspect can be explored through reviewing the key contents of the booklets, that is, advertisements, advice columns, and short stories about sexual encounters of different kind. A wide variety of goods advertised throughout these publications, including cheap cameras, toy guns, rings, and amulets that give the wearer the ability to achieve unlimited success in a wide variety of fields. Training courses on establishing small-scale chemical industries, and books on achieving success on the first night of the wedding. There are offers to teach, quote, and I quote, 325 secrets to great wealth, where one can learn to establish industries which require little capital but generate great profit, such as detergent powder, paint, varnish, textiles, pharmacy, electric goods, auto parts, phenyl, tinopal, which is a whitening agent, and information on how to get loans, etc. And a firm based in Gaya in Bihar advises that it has for sale a ring that it says that is capable of giving its wearer complete control over any man or woman, can ensure success in business, legal matters and exams, a good job, marriage according to personal wish, protection against bad spirits, success in lotteries and gambling, freedom from debt, and the ability to see buried treasure in dreams. And of course, it can also remove bad omen. It can help in improving memory, health, etc., etc. Then there's also a tantric ring, the advertisement, which is for rupees 51, horoscope that can be made to you according to your desire for rupees 151, and a special strong silver tantric ring for those who have faced disappointment in all aspects of life. End of quote. Now, also common advertisements relating to non-Western medical systems such as Ayurveda, and I'll go back to why I'm presenting you with this particular material. Now, these advertisements for Ayurveda and Unani-linked therapies frequently offer cures, both cures for ailments as well as ways of enhancing sexual experience. So, for Safed Dag, white patches, one advertisement says, in sexual diseases, consult Vad Shri Jwala Prasad, registered, Gaya. If you want to visit, please write and we will send directions. And then, of course, there is a sex course with naked pictures, Suhag Raat, first night of the wedding course with pictures. End of quote. I want to suggest to you that the booklets index a context of footpath modernity, where the relationship between the poor and the state and the market are in the nature of a promissory note that are very rarely honored. They speak of a world, the booklets speak of a world where remunerative means of employment, access to effective health services, opportunities for participating in formal financial processes, and prospects of equitable treatment by the legal and policing mechanisms are very hard to come by for the people who are the audience for these booklets. This then is the world of the intra-national diasporic subject, where the success that is being imagined in the commerce of greater height, magic potions to pacify one's enemies, miraculous rings for overwhelming power, and a course for successful Suhag Raat within the space, within the shared space of sex stories, says something about the contiguity of narratives of consumption of those of something about the contiguity of the narratives of consumption and those of subaltern masculine culture. So the goods and the offers that they make are context within subaltern masculine cultures are both enhanced and nurtured. That is to say, the booklet's appeal lies in the cultural and political economies of contemporary urban life that encompass more than something we might just label sexual culture. This is the space of the unofficial city whose residents service the official one, the formal one, but have no access to its facilities and comforts, as the COVID pandemic has shown us. Their attempts to engage with a hostile urban environment positions them as consumers of a wide range of strategies of life that might just possibly secure a degree of control over the environment in which they find themselves. Tantric rings and Ayurvedic therapies, secrets to great wealth, and surefire ways of founding a business empire, and freedom from debt and securing good health are the counter strategies of a subaltern male population that arrives in the city with well-established ideas regarding its masculinity, but soon finds itself relegated to the bottom of the city's cultural and political economy. In turn, and in search of a stable masculinity, he becomes an uninhibited consumer, moving between the formal structure of the city and the informal processes of the footpath, the street, and the village in the city. And of course, as many others have pointed out, the difference between modernity's formality and informality might itself be somewhat illusory. And so I won't go into that. But here I wanted to point to this the relationship between the formal and informal and the sphere of the context of cultural production of certain kinds of material that relatively poor young men deal with, and the context within which ideas of intimacy and sexuality are produced. Now, simultaneously, as it is difficult to posit the booklets as the site of an easily delineated sexual culture and easily delineated sexual culture, it is also tricky to speak of the images and text as instrumental in the task of gathering or concentrating desire at one place, a place we can identify as the sexual. Rather, I want to suggest to you, desire is scattered across a number of registers. The desire to be the consuming subject, enhancing sexual performance, deflecting possible harm to one's health and spiritual being, securing a source of livelihood, and effecting a degree of control over one's life. The subaltern migrant enters the city as a lowly creature and circulates within its various realms as a supplicant, forever seeking strategies to overcome, or at least not be fatally debilitated by his marginal position. The literature of the footpath, even when it putatively deals with sexuality, is imbricated in and addresses wider contexts of economic and cultural marginality, masculine anxiety, and loss of status. For the urban poor, the city is a site of unsettlement. Given the transitory context within which the booklets circulate, around railway stations and bus stands that are the key means of transport for the urban poor, and the slums and the unauthorized localities that are perennially under threat from priority public projects, the sense of perusing the material is fragmented, I would suggest to you, than focused. That perusal, looking at the material itself, is a fragmented activity. It is a practice that is located within, produced from, and produces the experience of the street. It is a world where, for example, the distinction between the outside and the inside, the distinction that is made by anthropologists and historians, for historians within context, that this distinction between the outside and the inside and the home and the world, that these distinctions are constantly under threat. An example from another slightly different publication will illustrate my point. The footpath pornography material can be found at temporary bookstores alongside many other publications that aim to provide information on sexual issues. Now, one of the best known of these is one that's called Sexology Darpan. Let me just go back to my, sorry. For many years, back covers of Sexology Darpan magazine have carried a particular advertisement for Delhi's Ashok Clinic. I just want to just toggle back between Ashok Clinic and Delhi's Ashok Clinic. Ashok Clinic is one of the most prominent of the many North Indian sex clinics that are familiar part of the urban landscape, being establishments that are frequented mainly by poor men seeking solutions to so-called sexual problems. Ashok Clinic also publishes a wide variety of advice booklets that are sold alongside the Footpath pornography material and publications such as Sexology Darpan. Hence, the readership of Sexology Darpan and Footpath pornography overlap to a great extent, and both these publications are part of the same socio-cultural circuits of intimate modernity. So this particular figure, this cover of the Sexology Darpan, shows the front and back cover of the magazine, a particular issue. Now, let us begin with the back cover, which is the advertisement for Ashok Clinic, the one clinic I just showed you. This clinic also advertises in Sexology Darpan, and you can, Sexology Darpan is also sold on various footpaths. If you look at the back cover, the centerpiece of the advertisement is a newly married couple that signifies both the putative problems in the ways of achieving marital bliss and the clinic's services that lead to this state, that will lead to marital bliss. The copy exhorts readers to not reconcile with an unsatisfactory married life and to add color to it through making use of its services. However, the conclusion that this might indicate the proliferation of ideals of bourgeois domesticity in contexts beyond traditional middle-class ones is, I think, easily undone if we flatten out the same issue of the cover of the same issue of Sexology Darpan, so that the front and back covers are visible at one glance. So this is the back and front cover. The back cover has the couple, and the front cover has the image of the naked woman. The apparent advocacy of settled domesticity and the possibilities of more disorderly sexuality exist as part of a menu of choices rather than mutually exclusive worlds within this world that I'm discussing with you. The quotidian experience of the quicksilver movement between having a home and being dispossessed is both reproduced and reflected in literatures that circulate in these spaces of instability. Hence, we might say that desire shuttles furiously between the home and the world, and the boundary between the two is almost as easily undone as the staples on the spine of Sexology Darpan that separate the back cover from the front. The next section is called Footpath Desires and the Erotics of Modernity. Footpath Desires and the Erotics of Modernity. The expressions of desire found in the footpath material cannot, I suggest, be explored through notions of delimited notions of sites and discourses. Desire is as if scattered around across multiple registers of modernity, and modernity itself is the site of arousal. Stating the problematic in this manner requires a reconsideration of the notion of arousal so as to disentangle it from narrowly conceived context of corporeal intent, from exclusively corporeal intent, and position it within larger contexts of contemporary urban, cultural, and political economies. In the majority of cases, the presentation of the footpath material, despite its apparent intent, is actually not very much like material that appears likely to elicit a sexual response. So while the covers advertise, say that there are photos inside, these are mostly line drawings printed on very poor quality paper. Further, the printing itself is of haphazard quality, with frequently blurred images and bleeding colors, as I've shown you in that first image. As you can see in this particular image. What then is the work of the low quality image produced through the processes of low grade mechanical reproduction? Rather than see these as instances of depletion of an authentic presence embodied in original works of erotic, Benjamin's argument, I think it is more fruitful to search for the aura of these images in a different context altogether. For the power of the footpath image derives from its inability to present a realistic representation of desire. As noted earlier, the women in these images are usually Western or Westernized Indian types. There is then an enormous distance of class and culture between the viewers and readers of feminine objects of desire. Indeed, parts of the fantasy lies in the complete inaccessibility of such women to the subaltern males who form the key readership for footpath pornography. It might be suggested that the lack of realism of the printed material merely extends the logic of distance between the representations and the viewer. Unattainable women and desires seem even more so through the lack of proximity, the verisimilitude between the image and the possible objects of desire. What is foreign remains so. This distance is in turn the productive side of an erotic culture that is both produced through the material or mechanical and the cultural conditions of Indian modernity, and produces modernity itself as erotic. Now, there are two other contexts that point to ways in which the sexual discourse of the footpath and the street might be understood as the erotics of modernity, or what I'm referring to as the erotics of modernity. The first relates to a contest between what I want to refer to as between disciplined and playful desire. Now, the booklets and the images can also be located within a smorgasbord of other kinds of visual and literary material that are sold alongside them. So, for example, along with footpath pornography, the subaltern male subject negotiates the street and the curved side among myriad texts of counsel, advice, and instructions regarding urban modernity. So, for example, I'm sure that many of you have are familiar with this particular image. Image. Now, these instructional posters is a case in point. Now, like a wide variety, as I'm sure many of you know, a wide variety of such posters are available for purchase. You can find them in homes and hotels, etc., etc. And this is just one example, the ideal boy one. There are others about community cleanliness, about fashion, bodily postures, etc., etc. The posters draw upon a discursive lineage that combines colonial, nationalist, and post-colonial discourses about the characteristics required of the subjects to become the subject of a successful modernity. This might include discipline, education, ethics, fellow cleanliness, personal courage, etc., etc. Focusing on personal endeavor and personality traits as avenues to modernist worlds of personal, social, and national achievement, the instructional impetus of the posters eschew any reference to structures such as class and caste. Of particular interest to this discussion, to my discussion, is the relationship between this kind of material and the footpath pornography material I've just discussed with you. Now, spatial specification is a particularly striking aspect of the instructional poster, like this one. So the ideal, frequently male subject of modernity learns to be modern through a civilizing process that imparts training in spatial behavior. That is to say, subaltern subjects of improvement move through classrooms where teachers are obeyed, tiled toilets and bathrooms where cleanliness is embodied, domestic sitting rooms where elders are respected, streets which must be kept clean of rubbish, libraries where silence must be maintained, hospitals where diseases are bested, and dams, which are, of course, the temples of modern India. The objects and subjects of instruction are, as it were, fixed in space. Society and nation are given concrete form, and discipline is spatialized. This spatial imagination of discipline has a long and diverse history in India. And although we have tended to focus on time in Indian history, space is very important. And due to the lack of time here, I won't give you examples, but there's a very long history of spatiality. If you read biographies and autobiographies of many Indian nationalists, and indeed when you read accounts by them as to how Indian chaos and European lack of chaos in Europe through a spatial chaos signifies ideas of modernity and backwardness. So there's a long history to space, and these posters build upon that kind of history of space. Now, the footpath pornography booklets disrupt the narratives of spatialized discipline embedded in these instructional posters, which in turn, of course, as I said, derive the impetus from older narratives of national greatness. The footpath images are located, I want to suggest to you, in the realm of spaceless narratives of desire and anxieties. I have mentioned earlier that the footpath materials emerge emerges from and is aligned to a context of great uncertainty and dislocation, and that it indexes a situation of enforced ruthlessness for the urban underclass. Hence, the visual fragments of footpath pornography are marked by a lack of spatial specification. Or to put it another way, their narratives are strewn across a number of spaces so as to make for an aesthetics of dislocation, what I want to call here an aesthetics of dislocation, where roughly sketched semi-nude couples in apparent moods of ecstasy stand to attention in a melange of bleeding hues. Westernized women strike suggestive poses with colorfully vacant backdrops, and disco dancers career motionlessly against barely lit backgrounds. This is the context then of an urban life world where spaces are rapidly transforming, often hostile, bewilderingly unfamiliar, out of reach, and depending on how often one is cleared out of the urban slum and shantytown, literally shifting beneath one's feet. Dislocated desire is a fragment of the erotics of modernity, where the experience of modernity is one of a series of ruptures. The booklets speak of these ruptures, and the essential narratives are built out of them. The second context that relates to what I referred to as the erotics of modernity has to do with the women of these particular booklets. A wide variety of women jostle for attention, both in visual and narrative forms. Typically, and of course, these are so-called westernized women or Western women. There is the continuity here, of course, with Indian cinema and the persona of now the figure that was now disappeared of the vamp, the most famous of whom, of course, was Helen. Helen was, of course, the site of displacement of male desire, a Western or westernized woman who could be the receptacle of fleeting desires, the girlfriend, rather than the anchor of a more permanent relationship, the wife. Helenness, what I would want to refer to as Helenness, finds play in the booklets through a number of ways. And the following story from a booklet called Raat Ki Rani by perhaps one of the most famous authors. I mean, there's no particular, I don't know, not one particular human person by that name, but the whole genre of these Mastram authors. And this provides a good flavor of what I mean by Helenness in this particular context. The story is called Pyar Ka Bhoot, the obsession of love, and concerns an affair between Tajinder, who's a Sikh, and Shirley, who's a Syrian Christian from Kerala. Tajinder is a businessman, hardworking Sikh businessman whose electronics business has been built entirely through the dint of hard work. And there's a whole notion of martial masculinity that gathers around Tajinder in this particular booklet. Shirley George, on the other hand, is a Christian from Kerala and lives by herself in an appointment in a posh South Delhi locality. Not infrequently in this particular story, Shirley is written as Shirley, and familiarity with women who carry the name Shirley also tells us something about the worlds of the men who are the readers and authors of these booklets. Shirley carries the sign of an Indian modernity that is both seductive and requires caution. She is single, a Christian, lives alone, and rides pillion on motorcycles, not side saddle where the legs can be kept together, with unrelated males. Shirley is also fond of whiskey and Western items of food, such as that classic Indian desire of Western modernity. She's always in omelets in this particular story. Shirley or Shirley and Tajinder launch upon a passionate affair that involves long car rides, frequent stays at five-star hotels at Tajinder's expense, and a great deal of whiskey and passionate sex that only the modern woman is capable of taking part in. During this relationship, Tajinder and Shirley visit Switzerland for a holiday. While there, Shirley goes on a shopping spree, spends lots of euros, incurs a massive debt, and she asked Tajinder for $5,000. And that, she says, is needed to help her father. Tajinder says that he doesn't have that money, and he can't give her the money. Shirley refuses to see him any longer. One day, Tajinder finds her drinking in the lobby of a five-star hotel with an army captain, as the story says, and he asks her about her declaration of undying love for him. She tells him to get lost and adds that she could never be slave to one man. Soon after, Shirley files a false case of rape, as the booklet says, and abduction against Tajinder. Despite his protestations of innocence, Tajinder is sent to jail. His obsession for love, the story concludes, finally dissipates. Pyar Ka Bhoot is a cautionary tale about the seductions and dangers of deep modernity of women such as Shirley and Helen. However, in an age of hyper-consumerism, the desire for the active and consumerist woman, such as Shirley, is also the desire to take part more intensively in the cultures of consumerism. Shirley is both an active subject of consumer culture as well as a commodity. Her deep modernity is a site of an intense erotic charge as well as threat, and the problematic translates into how to consume modern sexuality yet remain in control of it, of one's masculinity, how to manage the erotics of modernity, how to have but not have the modern woman. So I'll conclude this section through reiterating an observation made earlier. What we have in these booklets is a scattering and hence transformation of desire into a number of sub-desires, such that we can no longer say that we know exactly what sexual desire might be. What we can say, however, is that the footpath pornography material and the various contexts within which it is located plays with and expresses the erotics and fears of modernity. My next section is called At Home in the World, Savita Bhavi. Another kind of woman, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, has made an appearance some years ago in the world of Indian pornography. To fully engage with the context within which she is located, we need to explore different imaginations of urban space and processes than those that play within the footpath material I've just discussed with you. I refer here to the internet now, internet only, although there have been different incarnations, like a animated film. But it was once only an internet-only pornographic site known as savitabhavi.com. That, till it was banned by the Indian government, appeared to be extremely popular amongst internet users in India. According to various newspaper reports, around 70% of the site's traffic was in fact from India. The Savita Bhavi comic was published in 10 different languages, including and as well as English. Savita Bhavi, sister-in-law Savita, is a buxom, recently married. Savita Bhavi is a buxom, recently married housewife who, going by the illustrations, lives in a fairly upper middle class locality and an upmarket house. She wears a sindoor in a parting in her hair, the mark of marriage among traditional Hindus. The bright red sindoor is interesting since in large towns and cities in India, married Hindu women have increasingly taken to more discreet sindoor markings in their hair, very thin lines and sometimes just a smudge, for example. In many urban contexts, the thick sindoor in hair parting is increasingly seen as too traditional and somewhat backward. Modern women, in inverted commas, want to indicate their marriage, but through modernized tradition. Hence, many women now opt for ready-made strips that can be stuck on and then removed without much fuss. And then, as well, the sindoor is a marker of the woman completely devoted to her married life, in principle, and to monogamous conjugality. I want to suggest here that Savita Bhavi's thick sindoor application plays upon the erotic potential of the sexually voracious traditional woman. The excitement lies at the site of a putative transgression where the married woman is the object of desire, hence the making of an erotics of tradition. Simultaneously, as I explain later, unlike the footpath pornography material, the narratives of the Savita Bhavi comics strongly establish notions of the home and the world. They re-establish ideas of home and world. Of course, Savita Bhavi plays upon older and well-established notions of desire that are also present in footpath pornography and many other types of literature. The sister-in-law as a site of desire for younger brothers-in-law, for example, has a long history. Indeed, in many body ritual-related songs, the sister-in-law is, of course, a well-established figure of sexual innuendo, as well as someone who is frequently imagined as introducing young, uninitiated men into the ways of sex. Among various stories, Savita Bhavi seduces a traveling bra salesman, neighborhood boys, and a man who looks suspiciously like Amitabh Bachchan. She has a workaholic husband, hence a lot of free time on her hands. Savita Bhavi combines the erotics of tradition, or at least what is imagined as tradition, with contemporary contexts that relate to new forms of urban living, consumer cultures, and the politics of gender and sexuality that relate to both of these. In order to elaborate upon this, it is important to turn to the cultural politics of two new spaces, to some new urban spaces. And I want to refer you here to two new particular urban spaces. This discussion will help to point, as I can move toward my conclusion, it will help to point out the linkages between urban spaces, the making of a particular kind of middle-class subjectivity, and then finally to the figure of Savita Bhabhi. The first new space, and because of lack of time, I'm not going to read this out. I'll just briefly refer to this. The first new space I want to refer to is the Akshardham temple complex. Now, many of you might have been there. It's quite a fascinating place. It was built along the lines of Universal Studios or Disneyland, and the stunts there of Swaminarayan order that owns it, they visited Universal Studios, and the various attractions that are based on that. There is a Hall of Values, an IMAX theater, etc., etc. There's a big restaurant where men and women who serve you wear baseball caps. That's the Akshardham temple. There is a temple complex itself. And what is particularly interesting, why this is of interest to me in terms of talking about Savita Bhabhi and the cultures of intimacy, is that that it has a large numbers of single women who wander around and women-only groups. What I want to suggest to you is that urban spaces such as Akshardham have become the new sites which allow the emergence of a certain imagined middle-class female identity. That is, they're spaces where women can be both hyper-consumers, because Akshardham is very much a space of hyper-consumerism, with its different kind of the IMAX theater, etc., the goods and commodities that you can buy, the vegetarian McDonaldized food that you can eat. So it allows for by women a certain kind of consumerist activity at the same time that it is a space of religiosity. That is to say that it allows for the emergence of a particular kind of female identity where the woman can both be a hyper-consumer but also come back home to tradition. And I point this out to you because historically, as you know, the notion of the woman as a consumer in Indian history has been a problematic one, because it's been about women who give up their consuming life to sacrifice for the family. However, what is happening in spaces such as Akshardham is that this is a woman who can both be a consumer and come back to home. This is a woman who moves between the home and the world. And it is in this sense that spaces such as this reinstitute the notion of the home and the world. This is a woman who assuages male anxiety about the westernized woman with a deeply ingested modernity. She is not Shirley, the female visitor to Akshardham is able to negotiate the modernity-tradition divide through visible acts of traversing the paths that lead both to the temple and the shopping mall. So, this is something that's also there in many magazines such as Grey Shobha. So Grey Shobha, for example, has had for many years series of quite explicit articles on, for example, articles such as sex as a complete exercise, is it necessary to fake a climax, and menopause does not mean an end to sex life, along with the very traditional articles on cookery and religious festivals, etc., etc. So this apparently anomalous juxtaposition can fruitfully be understood as being addressed to the Indian woman who is authentically Indian because she has recourse to Indian traditions, if required. She can move along the narratives of modernity, but also pull back and return to tradition. And I want to suggest to you that this is also the context within which the appeal of Savita Bhabhi lies. The woman, the erotics of tradition, the woman who can have both, but is not determined by Western modernity. And I think this has particular significance in the present political context in terms of the political atmosphere in India and the relationship of women to consumerism. So in this, I mean, there are of course several other examples. I mean, the other example, of course, is the example of gated communities. Now, in many gated communities around India, which are vast developments all across India, you have the efflorescence of the most remarkable number of Hindu festivals. So Karwa Chauth, of course, is a very big festival. Now, simultaneously as women perform Karwa Chauth, they also then the very next morning do exercise in skin-hugging clothing. That is what I'm trying to suggest to you is the emergence of a number of urban spaces where a certain kind of female figure has emerged. The woman who is not determined of Western modernity, she can have Western modernity, but come back home. And this is my argument for suggesting that This is the broader context for the Savita Bhabhi comics, and the broader context of the trying to understand the broader field of cultural prediction, of cultural production of magazines such as Savita Bhabhi, and the manner in which they are consumed. Okay. Let me now let me just conclude. Yes. Okay, so at the Karwa Chauth festivities, elaborately dressed women perform public rituals as they transform the condominium space into a religious one. However, the morning after, the traditional finery, hands decorated with the henna and bangles and thick sindoor and hair partings, gives way to quite another set of activities. The traditional woman of the day before paces the condominium grounds in her exercise rounds, dressed in skin-hugging clothing. As in the pages of the women's magazine discussed earlier, there is a perception that one can move between the, albeit carefully controlled, worlds of tradition and its imagined antithesis, consumerist modernity. Consumerist modernity and its spaces offer then the possibilities of both maintaining one's reputation and taking part in disreputable activities denied by the open street. Women can have both. It is in this sense that the contemporary middle class notions of urban citizenship, with its specific configuration of manageably hybrid modernity, reformulates the fraternal social contract to include the consuming woman within its remit. And the female consumer citizen plays a significant role in the contemporary discourse of the making of the global city and its inhabitants. Further, the global context is significant in another way. It illustrates the contours of a transnational diasporic politics of modernity and tradition, as distinct from the intranational context that is relevant for the Footpath pornography material. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the comics, the Savita Bhabhi comic has, it had its origins in North America, and it is worthwhile speculating about the diasporic imagination of space, consumerism, and tradition that plays out within it. It is clear enough that the spaces, Akshardham, gated enclaves that I've discussed as contiguous to those within the Savita Bhabhi comics are the ones that might easily fit within the Anglo-American immigrant imagination of modernity. Additionally, it could be suggested that the figure of the modern woman, who is simultaneously located within the axis of tradition, is also one that speaks to notions of heritage that circulate among immigrant population, and of course, increasingly, as the diasporic imagination comes home to root India amongst Indian population, the ideas of heritage, for example. Savita Bhabhi, I want to suggest to you, is a manifestation of the woman of the gated community and the theme park temple complex, one located within its consumerist modernity. So she is traditional, yet able to express her sexuality of the world, but able to keep the street out of the home. Both desirable and yet the cause of some anxiety because of her identity as an active subject of consumerism. Savita Bhabhi is the woman who can move between tradition, she is married, and sexual modernity. Of course, while she's open about her sexual desires, wishing and willing to take part in a variety of sexual acts with both men and women, she's ultimately a woman of the home, flaunting both her thick sindoor as well as upper middle class house. It is important to remember that she does not appear to be a working woman herself. The material comforts she has access to are those through her ever absent husband, because he's always at work. It is this context, I suggest, that is the site of a neoliberal erotics. Despite the apparent autonomy indicated by Savita Bhabhi's passage, through and among a variety of urban spaces, goods and commodities, and strangers, she is nevertheless able to return to tradition, to her husband and her home. Savita Bhabhi satisfies masculine desires of a controllable domestic sphere and control over those who reside within it, commodities, and the modern woman who is nevertheless amenable to coming home. This is the woman who, while taking part in hyperconsumerism, is not determined by it, her agency being reinforced through participation in consumerism. In the Savita Bhabhi comics, then, the contemporary family is opened up to the forces of modernity in order to secure its traditional moorings, hence addressing a significant context of masculine anxiety. Savita Bhapi is then the site of a contemporary erotics of tradition. What I've tried to do in my talk then is try to situate ideas of tradition, modernity, sexuality, masculinity, anxiety, and intimacy within the contours of class, within the context of what's happening in cities, within the context of different kinds of audiences for these kinds of material, and ultimately to try and think about ideas of intimacy, ideas of sexuality, and relationships within the social context that now so much are part of contemporary Indian modernity, without necessarily reducing sex and sexuality either as a biological force or completely as a historical force. But trying to argue is that biology and history move together, and as to quote someone else, that we only become human through human history. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Srivastava. That is absolutely a brilliant lecture, which takes us through so many locations as we watch unfold this sort of shifting erotics of both tradition and modernity. And I think it's given us a lot to think about within the context of our own project, because I think often the feminist debates around many of these areas of women's reproductive labor can be somewhat reduced to a rather rational exercise of trying to think through a very constrained set of ideas regarding structure and agency and exploitation and so on. So I think this kind of, understanding the irrationality of, the market as it manifests and cultural norms as they are produced, I think is quite fruitful for us. So, so we are beginning to see a few questions pop up. So the first question is from Matthew Verghese, who wants to ask about the role of narratives and what is the role that they have in the materials that you present and contextualize so well. For example, this as against the more internet and smartphone circulated multimedia narratives that go along these works that enter into a relationship with spaces in question.
I think clearly, the informal material. Thank you for the question, Matthew. Seems to borrow its narrative form from the much more fragmented narratives that are there in sort of folkloric tradition. But I think it is that's too simple for me to say. I think actually the narrative form is actually also borrowed from the forms of urban life itself. And I would like to argue that it is an unsettled narrative form. In fact, the stories are completely bizarre, and the sense that for anyone who's familiar to much more modernist narratives of continuity, beginning and middle and an end, it's very disconcerting to read them, and you can only kind of fall back upon that. I think it was an old Buñuel saying that a film should have a beginning, middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And I think that so I think they reproduce certain narrative forms, which I think we should try and understand in terms of the narrative, the urban experience of people read them. And the Savita Bhavi form, of course, has a much more linear narrative form. Although I'm not one of those who subscribes to the idea that Indians are somehow constantly live in this world of circular narratives. It's as if for the last 100, 200 years, nothing has happened, and we have access to some kind of ancient circular narrative form. I think so that's why I'm trying to argue. I would much rather suggest here that narratives that whoever reads them, whoever reproduces them, whoever internalizes them, the narratives are a relationship between the author and those who are the readers of the narratives, and the readers of the narratives and the authors in this case, author and the readers of the narrative may belong to the same world and understand what narratives makes sense to the, and that is of the social world within which the readers exist. And the social world within the readers of Footpath material exist are quite specific, and I think the social world within which the readers of Savita Bhabhi exist are, I think, slightly different. So the narratives form differ, but I would sort of conclude by saying that narrative form, without offering some kind of a structuralist argument, is nevertheless dependent on the structures within which the readers of these narratives are positioned. And that's one, I think, not very satisfactory way of trying to answer your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question from Ketki Chakani, who asks, how would we read the new web series like Mastram on MX Player and Rash Bihari on Amazon Prime in terms of an erotic surf tradition and modernity?
That's a very good question. I can't give you a satisfactory answer. Ketiki, you might be better positioned. You might be positioned to provide some kind of response, because I haven't followed them. I followed much more trying to make sense of the relationship between how does one study the city ethnographically and the discourses that circulate within the city. So to be quite honest, I cannot give you an answer, and the answer that I'll give you would be very might be a little bit specious, I think. So, but I'd be happy if you could type in some comments and then we could have a discussion here. That would be great.
Great. The next question, the next set of questions is about Savita Bhabhi and the comic strip. So a question from Shohini Chakrabarti. Thank you for such a fascinating talk. To what extent do comics such as Savita Bhabhi reinforce notions of heteronormativity while trying to rethink urban, modern, and transnational spaces? And then an additional one from Anuja Agarwal, who says, thank you very much for your very illuminating paper. Just one question, what does the ban on Savita Bhabhi tell us about how the state looks at what you've referred to as an erotics of tradition?
Yeah, I mean, heteronormative, of course, in an obvious sense, you would say yes, right? So that's what Savita Bhabhi does. But its dominant theme is a heteronormative context, in a very obvious sense. But in terms of, I mean, but beyond the obvious narrative, it is difficult to say. I mean, I think it's in any kind of such any such reading material beyond the obvious, which is the most direct reading we might make of it. I think it's difficult to say that the obvious theme is heteronormative, and that's what its impact will be. I actually don't know, to be very honest, how the different kinds of people who read comics such as this, the relationship they have with it. It certainly reinforces certain ideas on the obvious aspects of it, of heteronormative desire. Although I think it reinforces them through very different means to how it might have done, say, I don't know, 50 years ago. It repositions the so-called traditional woman within the axis of particular kind of sexuality, and that's why I wanted to direct your attention to what is happening in other fields of the Indian public space. So if you read Hindi magazines like Grace Shobha and Grey Lakshmi, which circulate in very, very traditional homes, they're actually full of the most explicit discussions on women's sexuality. So on the one hand, we may well argue that all these sorts of publications reinforce certain forms of heteronormative ideals. But on the other hand, given that they talk so explicitly about women's sexuality, which you could say actually goes against the classic formulation of women's sexuality between heteronormative, by which I mean patriarchal context as well, which goes against it in as much as it foregrounds women's sexuality. So what does it do? I mean, I'm not clear that that we can provide one single answer beyond starting from that point of view. It starts from an idea of heteronormative sexuality, but I think the kind of thing that opens up, including these really otherwise very traditional magazines like Grey Shobha and Grey Lakshmi, the kind of things that they discuss, actually even English language magazines like Femina do discuss it, like, do you have to be a virgin before marriage? Does menopause mean the end of sexuality? And women to women relationships. So it does that kind of there's a multiple address to what is happening in India right now. Of course, the grounds from which it proceeds is heteronormative relationships, but beyond that, I think it also, not always directly, but certainly if you think about the kinds of questions it asks, these articles ask, it may also serve to question what we understand to be the traditional kind of themes and dictates within heteronormative sexuality. I mean, and I think that the more interesting question is to ask is that what is the work that it does beyond the obvious, and the obvious is of course heteronormative sexuality. What is the other kind of work that what possibly is the other kind of work that it might do beyond the grounds from which it proceeds, and that would be again, that's only one way of addressing your question, I think.
We have a few more questions. One is from Avipsha.
Oh, I'm sorry,
yes.
I missed that. I'll just have a quick. The ban. What does it say about the state? Well, the state in India is interesting because it does not ban films which are without showing explicit sexuality are deeply misogynist and etc. What of course it stays about what it says about the state is the manner it produces the subject of the citizen as a particular kind of infant in the state's mind, though the citizen is not infant in actual practice. And having said that, I think what's also happening is a changing relationship between the state and the notion of the ordinary citizen that I won't go into here. But certainly what it does say about the state is the manner in which the state imagines the subject, its subjects, though the citizens do not necessarily imagine that. And that's the peculiarity of the state's subject-citizen relationship. That citizens may go along with it, even how the state imagines them, though they never really imagine themselves as that. And it's one of the kind of never-ending kind of conundrums of the state-citizen relationship. Yeah.
Thank you. So a few more questions. One from Avipsha about how the education of women as a commodity, in the context of modernity, fit into the apparent, narrative of autonomy that you've been discussing. Then another question about the access of the footpath pornography that you referred to. What is the kind of access to these materials that women have at places like the bus stands? And then a third question around from Bhumika Joshi about how would you explain the notion of detachment and renunciation as far as Indian male desire is concerned. For my research, I meet a lot of men with entrepreneurial aspirations who seek value in detaching from sexual desire in particular and desire in general in order to succeed in the market economy. And these are not men in high value or high finance enterprise cultures, but have small stake businesses with, immediate returns. And then a larger question from Shitapa around what are the changes, what changes the forms and priorities of erotic consumption in an expanding neoliberal economy. So I just want to place this in conversation with the previous session we had on the history of various forms of erotic dancing in the Indian context. And one of the key drivers of whether those forms, quote unquote, succeeded or not in contemporary India is really the broader sort of socioeconomic changes. So Lavani was able to reinvent itself through its sort of, demarcation into a vulgar form and a folk form, which then received some state patronage, whereas other forms such as cabaret and mujra and certainly bar dancing have received, have been at the receiving end of the state. And I think all the images that you show really of Akshardham and the gated community, I mean, there seems to be quite a seismic change in the sort of political economy. And, other commentators might really see the hand of neoliberal capitalism in this through and through. So I would just wanted to posit that question for you.
Yeah, these are very, very, very interesting, but I think questions that require lots of reflection on my part. Let me try and address them as best as possible. I just want to begin by making one point. I'm really not someone who is, although I've used the term neoliberal, I'm not someone, I don't think it tells us very much about what's happening in different parts of the world, because it seems to me the term neoliberal, even though I use it here, and I want to be careful about using it, is a very functionalist term. In the sense that what it does
ये वापस से आंसू किए तुमने?
Please mute yourselves. Thank you. So that Sanjay can speak.
Thank you.
Hasina,
Okay.
please mute yourself.
Is it okay?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So what I'm saying that the responses I'll give here, I want to just contextualize them by saying that I think the term neoliberal, even though I use it off and on, I increasingly find it an unsatisfactory term because it seems a very functionalist term in the sense that it seems that by invoking the term neoliberal, we want to use one cause for explaining 1,000 effects. Whether it's universities or road construction or kind of weddings. And neoliberalism, it's increasingly a term which because it's sought to explain so many things, it seems to me carry less and less meaning. So I would much rather be interested in rather than saying a shopping mall is a neoliberal place of neoliberal consumerism, I'm much rather interested in saying why do young couples find shopping mall, young people find shopping mall interesting, rather than dismissing it as something that's neoliberal. Because neoliberalism again presents a very universal theory of capitalism. That's what. So what I'm trying to do here is to present a much more localized theory of capital. Now, just going on to the specific questions, I think Avipra's question, one of her questions was the relationship between commodity and autonomy. Sorry, I've written it wrong. Was that right? Versus autonomy. Sorry.
Yes,
Prabha,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry. I think I have it commodity versus autonomy. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the kind of if women are being educated to be commodities, how does that fit in with the narrative of autonomy that you're presenting to us?
Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. See, I mean, my broader point that I would make is that quite often there are articles people write about how people are, once they get tired of commodity cultures, they want to go back to the family and tradition. What I want to say to you here is I don't think there's anything beyond consumer culture. And I'll make that point very bluntly, so that consumer culture itself provides the problem and it provides putative solution. So it provides the problem here is women as commodities, and yet consumer culture itself, it seems to me, provides an answer regarding what it is to be free. And what it is to be free is that idea of choice. You can have both commodities, but you can also go back to tradition. I'm not arguing that is feminism as we know it, but I'm arguing that that is the way in which I try to think about ideas of autonomy within within the context of consumer culture. By which I'm also suggesting to you is that I don't think there is anything beyond consumer culture. That is the world in which we live in. So it's not that people escape to from consumer culture to family and religion. Religion and ideas of contemporary family themselves are produced through contemporary consumer culture. So I don't know how to, I mean, that's not a very hopeful answer, I think, but it's an answer that I think it's a context we should think about. What does it mean? For example, I was doing field work with at a cabin crew training, air hostess training institute, where young women would quite often young women would go dressed by wearing a burqa for training, change into mini skirts for training, and they come back wearing burqa, etc. And I was thinking about what does it actually mean? Do I just say like this is false consciousness, or do I say that perhaps that form of autonomy that is promised by this cabin crew training does something? I don't know what it does. Perhaps in a deeply structural, deeply asymmetrical society, that is the only form of autonomy that someone can have, who can perhaps get a job somewhere, and perhaps the next step might be that she might move on to someone else. She may not. But so it's that, I mean, I don't have a direct answer between women produced as commodity. Yes, of course. But what is the politics of consumer culture offer? What does it offer beyond us saying that it is just all false consciousness, or it's terrible, or that beyond consumer culture there's an authentic life? I would say to you that there is an authentic life. And then my next question would be then, what would be lost if I was to say to you that we are all surface creatures? What would be lost? That, when I meet you in the street, and if you ask me, how are you? You don't really want to know what my life story, right? You want to know, it's a service relationship. So in that sense, consumer culture does. It has provided us with certain notions of autonomy. I don't know whether it's not a revolutionary notion of autonomy, but within a deeply structural society such as India, is it a kind of autonomy that people can build on? I'll stop there. I know that, I mean, it's not a very straightforward answer, but it's a discussion to be had. And access to footpath pornography. Sorry, the question was who has access to footpath pornography? Did I get it right, Prabha?
Yes, something like that. I think she means that the public spaces being such male spaces in many cities,
Yes. Indeed. As I mentioned, the purchases are exclusively men, but I don't think the readers are exclusively women. And this, as I said, I come to this suggestion because in many traditional mainstream Hindi language magazines like Shobha and Real Lakshmi, there are often long articles about young women reading such material and getting distracted and, as the word goes, getting spoiled. Right. So I think that increasingly, because of the changing relationship between young men and women, and you see this in Delhi, it is quite possible that these are shared between boyfriends and girls, and because increasingly that kind of relationship is emerging in cities. So while the purchases are exclusively male, I'd agree with that, but I'm not convinced that the readers are, because in a very traditional, as I said, magazines such as Grey Shobha are raising this issue as a problem. The young women also reading it. The question about detachment and renunciation, that people say that a good way of well, that's a very taking part in market economy is through detachment and renunciation. That's a very interesting model, and it seems that's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about it very much, I have to say, except to, I think, offer you the suggestion that one of the great successes of the Prime Minister, of Narendra Modi, is precisely this idea that that a form of detachment can offer you deep consumerism. Modi is a detached and ascetic person, at least in public, but he offers you both a home tradition, but he's not anti-globalization. He offers you an entire engagement with market economy. In terms of so the detachment and renunciation in terms of from sexuality as a way towards market economy, I think detours through certain ideas about the male. And I think the ideas about the male here is the male who has, despite his idea of detachment and renunciation, which might suggest that he is beyond the home, that his power over the home comes precisely because he's so much a part of tradition. And if the home is a traditional thing, if the male is traditional in this particular manner, he has access to both the home and the market. Not as you suggest, as the question here suggests, not a detachment from either, but the bringing together of both. I mean, that's only really an unsatisfactory of answering that, because I think I haven't really thought about it as to what it actually might mean when people say this. And of course, I mean, in India, it's not so much historically, sexuality and asexuality, has been flip sides of the coin, and that would be one way of trying to address it. Again, it's a very good question. I think it needs to be thought about. Changes in the erotic consumption. Well, of course, and I did get to hear some of the last session. Is that a lot of the so-called older disreputable forms such as Lavani have found their way into contemporary cinema, right? Into contemporary film. And there's that Rani Mukherjee song, for example, I forget, Sawa Rupaiya, I think it's called, and various other forms. And increasingly, I think that this would be quite an interesting thing to watch. The manner in which our heritage, in inverted commas, increasingly becomes, even the disreputable heritage, as it were, becomes more acceptable as it becomes a part of sexualized consumer culture, within which those who watch it, those who subscribe to it, those who think this is part of our heritage, are those who are not only designated, not only imagined as purely westernized sexual beings, but also as being who can come back to Indian tradition. And I think that's one way in which different kinds of Indian heritage are coming back to us through consumer culture, which is why I said that I don't think there's anything beyond consumer culture. That going back to heritage, going back to family, going back to, I don't know, whatever, respecting grandparents is not an escape from consumer culture. It is that context where consumer culture is both a problem, but it's also a solution.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question from Karan Raj Singh Bhatia, who says, much of what you've written about female sexuality is in the context of consumer culture and emerging modernities, but it is not itself an expression of the Indian male gaze. The binary of the Madonna whore complex comes to mind here. For instance, what creates this traditional / modern binary?
Yeah, what creates? Well, well, in the Indian context, again, I think it's a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, you know, in the Hollywood context, you know, it was there, the red woman and the white woman, etc., etc. I think, again, what creates earlier, and I think that this binary is breaking down. I'm not saying that, you know, there's some kind of an outbreak of feminist thinking in traditional Bollywood cinema, but if you consider the fact that the vamp no longer exists, right? So once upon a time, there was Helen, and Helen had to die. Either she had to die, or she had to be reformed in some particular way. And that was a particular context of a particular kind of male hero, a particular kind of a woman. The woman of the leading woman, the woman who was not, who could only do certain kinds of things, and you know, and there. I think, I mean, it's a long discussion that has to be had for, you know, even as you know, Lata Mangeshkar sang only for the pure woman, whereas there was a different voice for the impure woman, mostly, not all the time, of course, but mostly. So Asha sang for the impure woman for Helen, and Lata sang for the pure woman. So there were, I think, a number of historically distinct nationalist and post-national trajectories that produce this binary between the Madonna and the whore in the Indian context. And just going back to the discussion we just had about the Lavani, for example, that there was, of course, the idea that the most significant performative woman, the public woman, was the woman who came from particular backgrounds. Either she was a traditional performing background, or she was a Muslim, for example. So one very significant aspect of the nationalist project was to produce a public woman who was not any of these. And as you know, All India Radio banned performances by the Gharana, people from the Gharanas, because All India Radio in the 1950s said that these were bad influences on Indian culture. So an entire process of producing certain kinds of national Indian woman, the most significant who was given voice literally by Lata. Okay? Just to cut my story short, you know, there were a number of contexts. One is the notion of the Muslim as the national woman. Can she be a national woman or not? Because most of public performance in North India, at least, were Muslim women. Can women who came from certain quota backgrounds, if you like, who were the women who first went to the film and did performances, public performance, can they actually exemplify popular Indian culture? And to all these questions, the answer by nationalism was no. So there is a long history to this, which, you know, we don't have the time here to discuss, which produces this Madonna whore binary, which begins to break down through process of consumer culture much more recently. So the vamp is no longer there because the young heroine of Indian cinema can do all those things, have a boyfriend, have premarital sex, etc., that the vamp earlier did. Which is not, I think, as I say, the rise of a new kind of feminism, but a new kind of consumerism, and we need to think about this.
Prabha? Great. Thank you, Professor Srivastava, for that wonderful talk and your analysis of you know, the whole erotics, the consumption of eroticism in context to India. I think that was fabulous. If anyone has any more question, could you please put it on the chat box, please? Uh, okay. Have we lost Prabha? Hello? Prabha, are you there? Sorry about that, Professor Srivastava. Hello, Prabha. I think we lost her. I was also wondering, I think, I don't know, Prabha, we lost her. I can't see her actually here.
Okay, that's okay.
I was also wondering, Professor Srivastava, if you could, this whole thing of Savita Bhabhi, because while Savita Bhabhi became very popular, if I may say, in the northern context, similar things were also, there is the culture of, similar culture we also see in context to Bengal, and they say Bodhi, and there are different kind of narratives around these very domesticated, heteronormative married women who are also, like, I mean, I can draw a parallel with Savita Bhabhi's, but they are much more invisible in nature. So I was wondering that, do you think it's also like, that when you talk about consumption, do you think it is very region specific also, the way people would consume erotic pleasure? And if you could maybe speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting point. Of course, South India, for example, has a long history of.
Yes, they have the for example, the Manorama, and like. So if you could just maybe, I was just wanting to understand that if is, and what brings this regional variation? Is it the construction of erotic that is different, or the imagination of the consumer that makes it so diverse?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think, I mean, again, it's something that needs sort of broader thinking, but I think the longer histories of regions are very important. In the North Indian heartland, for example, the history of the relationship with Muslims, for example, the class structure, the lack of, and the South India and Western India, for example, has had a series of social reform movements, right? And in fact, Southern and Western India has a very long history of sexology, which North India doesn't have. So a lot of the sexological material in Southern and Western India, in fact, the family planning movement starts from Maharashtra, also influences the manner in which a lot of the erotic material is consumed and written in Southern and Western India than it is in North India. And as I said, the religion question is very important. The class question is quite significant. And so, just so in Western India and South India, where you have a very strong sexology movement, there tended to be many so-called erotic texts that you could imagine as erotic texts, but they were often presented as a medical text because there's a long history of that, and also to escape the various government regulation, colonial era regulations. But I think that's not true to the same extent in North India. North India has not had a similar history of sexological literature, popular sexology, which Maharashtra has, for example, which South India has. In fact, some of the most significant writers on sexual issues in Maharashtra were mainstream novelists. There was a man called N.S. Parakhe, who wrote, of course, a very well-known novelist, but also wrote a lot on sexology, which was then borrowed by various other booklet type stuff. And so some of the themes that appear there are quite different from the themes that appear in North India. And I think one of the most significant issue in North India also has to do with the religious questions, a religious question. the Hindu-Muslim question in North India is quite specific and appears in a very different way than it appears in South, certainly South India, and that also influences some of the themes, the manner in which we consume. And this requires this regional variations in the consumption of these kind of literatures is a really significant topic, because again, if I'm going to argue there's no global history of capitalism, no kind of national history of consuming these kinds of things, and that requires us to think about the historical developments in these regions that affect everything, including how people read this kind of literature and the themes that are present in this kind of literature. And these some of the themes I've just pointed to might be of significant.
Okay. Thank you for that, Professor Srivastava. We have one question from Geeta, and she's asking that, do you think that the contemporary breakdown of the good women, bad women binary could be due to the democratization of or internalization of feminist thinking over the last 4 decades?
I would, I don't. Those of you who understand Hindi, there's a very famous saying, "Aapke muh mein ghee shakkar." I hope you're that. But I think I wouldn't. I think to certain extent there is some amount of bleeding in of some kinds of feminist thinking. So, not entirely, but I mean, I would be willing to risk the opinion that yes, I think you're right. That in some aspects of autonomy, that certainly you find this among young women. Certainly you find some young women who live in who are living in relationships. But there's always that problematic aspect. Quite often these cases that she has been raped by this person, and quite often these cases are not all of them, but many of them are where the woman has been living with a man, and now because of the larger context within which she has to go back to, she will be seen as someone as a stained woman in effect. So whilst on the one hand, I think there is certainly some borrowing from some forms of thinking about premarital sex, about being single, about living with a man before you get married, about having boyfriends, having girlfriends, etc., about certain forms of autonomy and sexual autonomy. I think it does borrow from that, but from very popular magazines. And I would even argue that these ideas come to various young women from precisely these magazines I've referred to, like Grey Show. Ironically, as ironic as that might sound, there's some amount of bleeding in of feminist thinking through these magazines as a via media to the people who read them, simultaneously as they continue to exist in deep structures, quite conservative deep structures. So in fact, if you read magazines, I think there are various wedding magazines in India, right? And a lot of them and they're all about wedding planning, how do you plan a wedding, etc., etc. And that it says you can do various things, you can do this, that, the other, you can have this choice and that choice. But ironically, the choice is always about the commodities you can consume. It's never about the spouses that you can choose. So there's always this kind of double bind that people exist in this notion of autonomy, but they don't exist outside the structures. Not all of them. Some do, obviously, and are able to do certain kind of things. But the majority, I think, is aware of, through these magazines I've just referred to, so-called feminist thinking, but then is constantly having to negotiate that thinking that it might have taken on board with the very real structures within which it must continue to exist.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The questions continue to come in. I think what we will do is definitely share them with you. But for now, we want to thank you very much for a very, very thought-provoking lecture. I mean, we've all obviously read your work and we're very influenced by it. And I think we could quite easily have yet another lecture from you on actually how to go about doing the kind of fine-grained ethnographic work that you've done, but also link it up to larger theoretical questions. And certainly we hope very much that we'll have opportunities to converse in the future and to continue learning from you. Thank you so much, Professor Srivastava, and thank you to all our participants for attending patiently. And any unanswered questions, hopefully we will be able to send it on to Professor Srivastava, and he will respond to you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.